The FDA has announced it's going to be recommending restrictions on the J&J vaccine. It's not going to be outright pulled, but they're going to basically what they're telling people is that if you can get a different vaccine that is not J&J, then you should get that unless you specifically request J&J. And what they're basically citing are blood clots. These are the same issues that had it pulled back in April of 2021. It rolled out very quickly. I actually wound up with it. We can talk about that in a second. And then it was pulled shortly after I got it, and then it was re-implemented over this issue of these blood clots. So what do you make of this? Deep. We're deep into the vaccine period. That now they're coming back and saying, you know what, actually, let's try to minimize use of this as much as possible.
I think this is one of the biggest disasters of the entire COVID period. And I don't think there's any way going back from what a level of institutional distrust this is going to, how much this is going to contribute to the decline in institutional distrust. Because if you rewind the tape back to when this vaccine first came out, when all the vaccines first came out, the way that so-called experts were talking about it is so completely diametrically opposed to the fact that now they would actually take this step of recommending the other vaccines over it because they acknowledge there are problems with the rare blood clots. People would say you don't have to wait for the experiment to play out. We know what's going to happen with all of these drugs down the line with great confidence. It's all fine. And so for an actual official sort of arm of the government to walk that back, it's true these blood clots are rare, but to walk that back after the level of confidence and smugness and just speaking down to people, exerting control over people, to walk that back, I think is an incredible disaster.
And the argument that the public health authorities are making is that at the time, they have more data, they're saying, but at the time, the risk of getting COVID outweighed the risk of getting the vaccine, and there wasn't enough vaccine around. Now there's enough of the other vaccines so that they can now take a more cautious approach to J&J. I think the problem with that is that the people who were most susceptible to these blood clots, my understanding, are women in their kind of 20s, 30s, and 40s, are not the most susceptible to hospitalization and death from COVID. And so if they knew ahead of time, what they could have said is that if you're a woman in your 20s, 30s, 40s, don't take J&J. Whereas they were messaging that those were the people who were more at risk, but they didn't kind of come out with a hard sell to say don't move forward with this vaccine. And after the pause, they came back and said, okay, this is safe and effective was the word that you would hear on the radio or you would hear from the FDA.
Right, and that's what's so frustrating about this is, average citizens are not scientists and cannot be expected to be medical experts or scientific experts and evaluate the efficacy of every vaccine. We outsource that work to other people. We can put in as much work as possible to make sure that we're safe, our families are safe, but ultimately the interpretation of the science, we do outsource to people. We need to have that trust. And so I think, Ryan, everything you just outlined makes complete sense. And yet it's still so frustrating that the safe and effective line was trotted out. And here we are like 2 years later. I mean, I'm vaccinated. I hope my friends and family are vaccinated. But I feel like this is just a devastating blow to public trust that has been devastating over and over again for the last 2 years. It's so vindicating for people who said there were problems with this vaccine and were talked down to and criticized and actually marginalized in so many different ways.
And there's also a racial and a racial justice element to this. And I think one of the mistakes that public health authorities made at the beginning was, in a very well-meaning way, they started messaging that they were going to kind of put people of color in the front of the line for the vaccine. And there were a variety of arguments that were made for why this was. Some of them had to do with frontline workers being disproportionately people of color. Others, were more connected to kind of like legacy of racism and almost kind of entered into like reparation conversations. But what they didn't understand is that for people of color in this country, that message is received in a completely different way than it's being intended. What so many people heard was, oh, you want to experiment on us with this vaccine first. It wasn't like, because when on earth had kind of the white public health officials around the country done something actively good for no reason for people of color in this country? If this, and I genuinely think that they had good intentions, but you can imagine how that would be looked at with such skepticism. Yes. And then I actually wound up, and there was also a little kind of subtle racism to it as well, or I can explain how. Like, so I was living in Vermont at the time, and Vermont had a policy that people of color and their households could get the vaccine first. That was their explicit policy. A very small people of color community in Vermont, but because my wife was and is a person of color, they reached out to her and said, you're now eligible for the vaccine, as is everybody in your household. So that meant I was front of the line for this. And so I told her, I was like, I bet they're going to give the Johnson & Johnson. And it was the Johnson & Johnson. And as the public health authorities explained, it was because they didn't trust these marginalized communities to come back for the second shot. And
Disgusting.
So many more people of color wound up getting the Johnson & Johnson than the Pfizer and Moderna. And so now here we are with the initial suspicions of people, the initial skepticism of people kind of being borne out, even if it wasn't a direct line.
I would call it the soft bigotry of low expectations, but that is worse than soft. It is disgusting. And it's a problem with a lot of this. Yeah, exactly. And maybe I'll talk about this next week on Rising Friday, but if you go back and watch, one of the most embarrassing, lame excuses for a comedian in the country is Jordan Klepper, just a classism machine. If you go back and watch a Man on the Street interview he did on the vaccine, I think it was in New York City. I think I'll probably just talk about this on the show. We can add it in post. It's insane to rewind the tape and look at how people were talked to for having some of these concerns that have now been vindicated by the government officials that were telling everybody it was fine, and the sort of dutiful media lapdogs that took their cues from them and just tore the country and tore working people, average people who have very good reasons not to trust institutions, to shreds. Incredible stuff if you rewind the tape.
Indeed.
Well, this is Rising Fridays has come to an end, sadly, but of course we'll be back here next week. If you ever have any trouble keeping track of what day it is, just if you see Ryan and I, that means the weekend is here. So maybe we can sort of start generating a Pavlovian response with all of you. You see us, you know the weekend is here, and then you love us.
Unless you wait until Monday to watch this, then, man, are you in for a rude surprise.
Yes, that's true. Okay, well, watch it on Fridays then. Help us out. Well, also, speaking of helping us out, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are also available anywhere you listen to podcasts. We so appreciate all of your kind words and feedback. We've been doing this show for several weeks now, having so much fun. So please make sure to tune in every Friday. And with that, we will see you next Friday. And Ryan, you better be here in person.
I'll be there. We'll be there. Can't keep me away.
Yes. We'll see you then.